enough because I cannot figure out the microphone, so I apologize in advance. I'm actually Payne from Kinley Horn. I'm the new event and speaker coordinator. So I'd just like to welcome everybody here. Sorry if you can't hear me in the back. I'll try to yell louder. So today we have a few speakers. The first one is Jack Gleason from the DNR. He is a area hydrologist, and he will be talking on the waterbody and waterway delineation and regulation with DNR Public Waters. We'll be doing an overview with that. Amanda Yuld is also here, who's an area hydrologist. And then from Army Corps of Engineers, we have Leslie Day. She is the mitigation coordinator for the St. Paul District. And then we also have Kristen Hafer on behalf of Chad. Chad was unable to attend today, so I apologize for that. But we have Kristen instead, so let's give a little applause for her.
Thanks. I'm going to go, this presentation is intended to last about a half hour. And so then there'll be a lot of kind of coordinated with the core presentation, so there'll be hopefully plenty of time for questions after that. I guess you could interrupt me with questions, but just know that there has been time set aside at the end for that too. So when I was contacted by your WPA leadership about doing a presentation, they had said that the members were interested in learning about OHW, ordinary high water level information, and especially on watercourses. So that's going to be kind of the core of this presentation. But the OHW kind of only makes sense in the context of our public waters program. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about so this is basically the overview of the presentation. I'm not going to read right off a lot of the slides. You guys can go ahead and just kind of read through while I'm talking. I'll just highlight certain things. So that's what we're going to talk about first is, what is a public water? What was the public waters inventory process? And then OHW, the whole reason why we have, one of the main reasons why we have the public water is because of there's associated permit program that applies to those waters. And then I thought I would just add a little bit about just kind of at the tail end, a little bit about the buffer mapping project and kind of some tie-ins with OHW and public waters there. Okay, so public waters are lakes, wetlands, and watercourses that meet the statutory definition and that are designated on the public waters inventory map. So I have that legal definition, but the idea of doing the inventory was that once the inventory process was done, nobody had to have the discussion, is this a public water or isn't it? We would just know that it's a public water. And so I'll get into that process a little bit. It was based on, the inventory was done based on this Minnesota 1979 law, and it was a county-by-county process, and it was a mandatory process. So the DNR was told by the legislature how to do this process and the definition of a public water. And I am going to talk a little bit about the process because it's come up a lot lately, especially since the buffer mapping project. Like the public waters is a little bit of kind of a sleepy program. And with the advent of the buffer mapping project, issues regarding public waters kind of erupted through landowners around the state. That maybe landowners that had property along a watercourse and never knew it was a public watercourse, and now they had to have a 50-foot buffer on it. And so so there was a lot of scrutiny legislatively and other ways on what this process was back in the day. So generally the process took place in the early 80s, and it started out with the DNR created a preliminary map and list of public waters and provided it to the county, and then the county would have a public meeting on it.
Okay, I'm going to get your microphone working.
Okay. How's that? Okay, that works, I think. So the process, there was a public notice in the county paper, and then there was a public meeting run by the county, and then the county board would submit comments to the DNR. And basically, at this point, it was the definition of a public water was always the basis of evaluating any comment. So a lot of the comments at that point, it was basically if the county said this wetland doesn't meet the definition of a public water, we would review it, and if we agreed, then we would take it off. If we didn't agree, then we would leave it on. And then after that process with the county, there was a public notice in the county newspaper, and the map, the PWI mapping was published in the local newspaper. And then there was a 90-day challenge period where anybody could challenge the designation of any, wetland, lake, or watercourse as a public water. And those petitions then were reviewed by a 3-member panel. And so this is county by county. So for a county, there was somebody appointed by a county commissioner, somebody appointed by the DNR, and somebody appointed by the county SWCD. So one way to think of it is the DNR was outnumbered 2-1 on any, and they vote for each petition. That 3-member panel would vote on whether they were going to accept the petition, remove from the public waters, or leave it on, or in some way modify it. So at the end of that challenge panel process, that panel would produce conclusions, findings of fact, and sign it. And at that point, then, that process was over. So we said, here's our public waters inventory list and map, and then the lawsuits could start. And so anybody that didn't like the decision of the challenge panel could sue, basically. And so the DNR sometimes would challenge the findings of the challenge panel. The county would challenge us. Individual landowners would challenge it. You could have a third party, NGO, Pheasants Forever, could file a lawsuit against these decisions. So at the end of that process, when all the appeals were completed, then the final map and list were published. So sometimes a lot of the process was taking place in 80, 81, or 82, but for some of the counties, the process wasn't finalized until the mid or late 80s because the appeal process could take so long. So then we had, that was the inventory for that county. The DNR has very limited authority to change the public waters inventory now. After the inventory, the DNR had no authority to change the public waters inventory. It wasn't until 2010 that we were given the statutory authority to correct errors. And the way that works is that it had to have been an error at the time of the inventory. So if now, say you go somewhere and there's a wetland that's, maybe degraded, maybe it's not a type 3 wetland anymore, and somebody says, well, that doesn't meet the definition. Today, that doesn't meet the definition of a public water, we want it removed. We'd say, well, whoever is asking us this, we'll help them, but they need to provide evidence that in 1981, or whatever the year was, that wetland did not meet the definition of a public water. So it's a pretty high standard to demonstrate that there was an error. And so we're looking for, those kind of historical evidence, maps, aerial photos, site photos, plats, whatever people can dig up to make their case. Prior to 2010, what would happen is I've seen many, letters kind of come trickling in to us from all corners of the state where the DNR might have sent a letter to a landowner saying, yes, we reviewed the watercourse that flows through your property, and we determined it does not meet the 2 square mile threshold for a public watercourse. Therefore, we won't require permits for activities that take place on it, which is different than saying, it's not a public water anymore, because we didn't have the authority to say it's not a public water. We would just say you don't need a permit. Now we would say we'll delist it as a public water. And just because of the last couple of years, because of the kind of the energy against the public waters inventory, trying to get everything delisted, you know, it's kind of important to remember that the Supreme Court has upheld that the process and the DNR's regulation of working public waters are constitutional, and there's been several court cases that support that. So, you know, we get a lot of landowners and county officials telling us that that our process was illegal, it's an illegal taking, or we didn't do proper notice or whatever, but we, you know, this kind of addresses those concerns. It doesn't make those people happy, but it's a pretty solid legal basis. So some of you may have seen these. This was, when they did this process, we didn't have desktop computers. So the maps were hand-drawn. And so there was a base map, a highway, MNDNR County Highway Map Series that was used. And so all those watercourse lines, these, you know, you can kind of see the dark lines here were all, if I can get my cursor going here, oops. These lines were all hand-drawn. And then there was some kind of process where they did overlays to stencil in the basins. I'm not sure exactly how they did it, but they used like Mylar overlays somehow, and were tracing things from other sources to put on the public waters inventory map. So it was really quite the manual effort to do it. And so these are still considered the authoritative source of public waters information. And then this is maybe more if you have a GIS system, there is a data layer. So this is more, you know, luckily we don't have to look at this, or sorry, this, having problems with page opening. Oops, I'm going down here. Luckily we don't have to, well, I'm really going wrong. Here, let me get out and do this, since I don't know where I am with these keys. Sorry about that. Luckily, we don't have to look at this all day, right? So, oops, okay. Okay, yeah, so this is, you know, so I symbolize this in my own GIS desktop to show, you know, the public water wetlands are green, the public water basins are blue, and the watercourses are in the dark blue lines. So now the ordinary high water level. So there's also what's up in front of you is the statutory definition of ordinary high water level. This is the boundary of the water feature that the DNR has jurisdiction. So it's an elevation that tells us where on the landscape does the public water start or end, depending on if you're going lakeward or landward. And so it says the highest water level that has been maintained for a sufficient period of time to leave evidence upon the landscape, commonly the point where the natural vegetation changes from predominantly aquatic vegetation to terrestrial. For watercourses, it's top of bank. That can be challenging especially in altered systems. And for reservoirs and flowages, it's the normal summer pool level. And here's, I don't know, hopefully a lot of you have maybe seen a schematic like this, where it's talking about, you know, here's your ordinary high water level here. So this is, you know, the colors make it hard, but this is pointing to terrestrial vegetation right here, and this is aquatic vegetation. So it's kind of that sweet spot right in between. It's not an average water level, and I talk about it a little bit later, but there's a link here for, There is a technical paper, a DNR technical paper, we call it the OHW white paper, that describes in more detail the process. And it basically uses tree evidence. And there's certain kinds of trees that can withstand some water, some that can't stand any water, and I'll get into that in a second. So it's not, what is the OHWL is not, it's not a runout elevation, it's not an average water level, it's not the flood elevation, and it's not an arbitrary elevation set by an individual group or agency. We get lots of requests for arbitrary OHWs, and it was developed by Adolf Meyer a long time ago, I think like in the 50s maybe, or early 1900s that says. Okay. I thought it was a little later than that, but, and then basically that second bullet is just talking about, as the DNR staff was getting distributed out, around the state, and there was more, and then there's also the shoreline zoning ordinances came on about the same time, so that's land use kind of incorporated into city and county zoning ordinances, and that, when you talk about a setback from a public water, it's using those zoning ordinances refer to the OHW. And so the DNR has a specialized hydrographic survey crew that does the kind of formal determinations. So by specialized crew, there's 3 guys on it, and that's all they do. That's all they do their whole career, pretty much. The head of that survey crew now, I don't know, I think he's worked at the DNR for 25 or 30 years, and he had to wait, about 20 years to take over the lead of the survey crew, because the previous supervisor had been there for about 30 years. So there's a lot of continuity in the survey crew. And they're the ones, when you see an established an actual elevation, it was determined by their crew. They do write reports, and they are available. They're not easily available, but you can request them, and you can get them from the area hydrologist. There are a lot of public waters that don't have determinations, most watercourses and a lot of wetlands. There are still some lakes too that don't have, if there's never been a reason to do a determination, like it might be, like Lake Itasca doesn't really matter. Nobody's gonna do a project, on Lake Itasca that requires a permit probably. So, Lake Itasca might have an OHW, but there's probably not really a strong reason for bodies of water surrounded by public land to have them. And the OHWs, many of them are available at the DNR Lake Finder, so this would mainly be your lakes. So I just the last couple weeks I've been doing some research on Medicine Lake, and so this is available through the intranet, and you'll see right down here has the ordinary high water level. I don't know, you guys might have known that before too. I think there's actually a mobile Lake Finder app, and if I didn't, when you go to Lake Finder, you first have to put in like your lake name or with the county, with or without the county, and then you have to actually select the lake, and then when you get to that point, on the left margin, there'll be some options, and it will say water level data. If you click that water level data, you'll get a screen like this. You can also get the history of water level data that we have too, can be downloaded from the same place. And so here's a reference to the technical paper again, 1993. The paper's 10 pages. What's on your screen there is what it says about watercourses. So it's basically saying it's not constant because watercourses slope, obviously. And there's words like, when the tops of the channel bank on each side of the watercourse vary considerably from one another or are indistinguishable along a given reach. Just whatever you decided is it has to be consistent with other OHWs for that stream or river. And so basically what the only point they're making there is say you can, there's a good top of bank here, and you shoot an elevation, and and you do a cross section here, and you get a good elevation, but here, there's not, the bank heights vary a lot, or maybe there's not a bank on one side. Here, they're just averaging the upstream and downstream elevation for the OHW. So it's, and this is all that white paper talks about for water courses, so it's pretty limited, admittedly. Get into some examples. So this is where, in this case, it seems pretty clear, that that's top of bank. So another way of thinking of top of bank as kind of a proxy is bank full elevation. So a lot of you might be familiar, it's a channel forming flow that occurs, it's a 1.5 year, 2 year recurrence interval. And the bank full height is where the water will, spill over the banks into its floodplain, and then that releases the energy, so then it's less erosive. So you guys probably mostly know this, and just very basically is what happens when you start getting more and more water flowing into a system beyond what the channel was kind of historically sized for. It can start to insize, and so we'll just keep getting deeper and deeper, and then what happens is it's not connected to its floodplain anymore, and so then those erosive forces can never escape out over the bank. So that's an example of where it's hard to tell, like, okay, so I'm standing on like a cliff here, and the streams in the bottom, it just has been incising. Well, the 2 year flow might be way down in the channel somewhere, but you're standing on top of the bank. So it can be a little bit of a challenge in some of those cases to be really precise. Here's another example. This is it's actually a public water course that's been ditched. But it's probably a historical thing, and so they were allowed to keep doing maintenance. And so then there's this is a 2-stage ditch, which some of you might be familiar with. So this is designed to do exactly what I was just talking about. It's this area here is basically kind of acting as a floodplain for the channel. So when the channel gets up to that bank, it can spill out and relieve some of those shear stresses to reduce erosion. In this case, I would say that this is called the first stage. The top of the first stage channel would be the OHW. Because really what I'd argue what you're seeing there is that second stage is really the floodplain. So a little bit more about, the formal methodology to determine OHW is based on evidence of water level regime left on the landscape. It's difficult to apply to altered systems like a 2-stage ditch, entrenched channel that has little or no connections to its floodplain, or a large river with significant backwaters. There's other cases. And so we do use bank full flow as a proxy for OHWL at times on water courses, and I'd already talked about some of that. It's usually evident in natural systems, so it makes a good proxy for an OHW elevation. And where a detailed calibrated hydrologic flow model exists, we'll often use the 2-year return flow from the model as a bank full elevation. So, we're sitting here in Bloomington, and when I was the area hydrologist, this was the area I covered, and I remember one time, we were wondering about, there was a project that was going to take place on the banks of 9 Mile Creek, and the 9 Mile Creek watershed district engineers had done, the watershed district had done a detailed model of it, and so I basically called up the engineer and asked, what was your 2-year flow at this location on 9 Mile Creek, got the elevation from them, and just use that, advise who's ever doing the project. If you go below that elevation, you need a permit. If you stay above it, you're okay. There might have been a little bit more research than that, but that's kind of how that might work. And so really your most important contact for OHW information, especially like for water courses or for basins that don't have them, is the area hydrologist. We have like Lake Finder, that's an external database. We have an internal database that might have more OHW information than what's available publicly. There's actually, believe it or not, there's paper files. You have to, we're the government, so we never throw anything away. And so you have to remember this program goes back, well, so the public waters were done in the early 80s, but there had been a permit program since the DNR was regulating work since the 30s. And so there's information in some of those files that goes mainly back to about the 50s. Usually is the furthest back we have. And there might have been cases where, the DNR hydrologist is authorized to make their own call for where, an OHW, kind of an on-site specific OHW determination. And so some of those notes, like maybe 20 years ago, the area hydrologist had made an OHW determination. There might be a note in that lake file or wetland file that has that information on it. So I use those. Sometimes I look in the file and sure enough I find it's not common, but it does happen. We do have, within our the DNR with their floodplain mapping might have access to detailed flow models. So the area hydro can make a call to another DNR employee and say, hey, do you have a model for whatever? We also have, and this we intend to get published on our website so that everybody can see it, but we also have the Metro Mississippi River elevations based on a model that we use for OHW as a proxy for OHW. And so if somebody says, hey, I'm doing this project on the city of Minneapolis, I'm doing this project, putting in a new outfall, here's the lowest elevation I'm going to impact, do I need a permit for that? We can look at that information and determine yes or no. They can, and like I mentioned, the area hydro can actually do a site visit and point to a spot on the ground and say, if right here, I'm declaring this the OHW. If you do anything inside of that, you need a permit. If you stay outside of it, you don't. LGUs can actually make their own OHW. It's not, I don't know if I'd call it that OHW determination. I did in the bullet point here. But they can, for purposes of setbacks, if there's like a wetland, and their shoreline ordinance might say, they need to be structure setback needs to be 50 feet from a wetland, and we don't have an established OHW, we don't need to have our survey crew go out there and do one. They're just free to say, hey, we're in the cattail stop, that's where we're gonna measure the 50 feet back. And we can help them with that stuff, but we don't need, in most cases, we don't need to do a formal determination for some of that. And the area hydro can help navigate when do we need to request the survey crew to do a formal survey, and when don't we have to do that. And then just one other kind of a reminder, or trying to get the word out, that when you see the boundaries on our public water inventory maps, so the digitized shapefile files, that boundary you see is an approximation. It's not actually the OHW. So, there's a whole lineage of where these polygons come from. But you have to be aware they're just approximations. Anything we publish says they're approximations, and you can't go by this line to decide if you need a permit or not. And so like even this, if you kind of dissect this basin a little bit, mouse isn't working, you can see some of it might just be the angle that it's in shadows, but you can see here it looks like this part of the polygon's in the trees, so it's probably on the other side of those trees, like along here it looks pretty good. It might include the slope here, it probably does. You know, up in that northeast corner, you can see it probably needs to be in a little bit. And any polygon you take, you can play that game with. So it's really the established, if there's a established OHW, that's the elevation. If there's not an established one, then that's where you might need assistance from the area hydro determining that. So I was going to just segue quickly into the public waters work permit program, just a couple of slides. And so there's another PWI map. And so just to step back a little bit about, you know, when we talk about permitting and the DNR, it's really what, you know, the DNR is, you look at the DNR mission, it's really, I listed it there. We're basically, you know, trying to conserve and manage the natural resources, and also provide outdoor recreation opportunities, and also provide for commercial uses of natural resources. So that might be like, our DNR has a division of forestry. What do? They manage timber sales and, you know, growing timber for the timber industry, the wood industry. Mining, that's another, DNR regulates mining in our state. We also have parks and trails can, you know, you all know that trails can be, you fill in wetlands for trails, right? And so if we were going to be all that top one, the conserve, then a lot of that stuff couldn't happen, right? And so basically, you know, the message is the Minnesota water laws and permit programs aim to balance reasonable use with protection. So it's all this balance is really the message. So that's what our public water permit rules are really an attempt at achieving that balance. Here's there's a whole bunch of statutes and rules that kind of trickle down into, or statutes that trickle down into the actual permit rules. And when you look at these rules, it will even say what the statutory links back to this authorizing statutes. Basically what we're saying is permits are required for might be required is probably what I should say, for any activity affecting the course, current, or cross-section of public water. And then there's some exemptions, which are utility crossings of public waters. That's handled under a license through our Lands and Minerals Division. We have our aquatic plant management program, which is our fisheries division. The aeration permit program, which is actually in my home division of ecological and water resources, and Amanda is here today. That's her responsibility now, is to manage that program, and she's also helping with public waters and buffer mapping stuff. The surface water structures, such as, you know, watercraft buoys and other surface water stuff, is county sheriff.